Let's talk a little bit about some of the issues in essay writing and some of the problems you want to avoid. What follows here is a list of two sets of common essay errors, major and minor. The major ones will certainly get you in trouble and prevent you from getting even an average mark, and they are serious defects in the writing. This is not something you can fix before you start writing. I think that the best method you should consider using in your writing is to proceed as you always have. Obviously that has worked for you to some extent, but once you get the draft complete, you have to go back through these items here and ask yourself whether or not you have actually addressed the weaknesses that these point out to. So the first major defect in an essay is a vague or missing title. So if you have no title at all, or if you have a title that is a topic, for example, Sexism and Taming of the Shrew, is a title, but it says nothing about your thesis. It's a topic. You're going to be talking about sexism and taming of the shrew, but what are you going to argue? Are you going to argue that Kate or Bianca are both females who are sexist and who inherit sexist roles and buy into them? Do you want to argue that Petruchio is sexist? You want to argue that the play basically deconstructs sexism? These are all different kinds of arguments that would then need proof. And so this is what you need to be vigilant about. An even worse title would be essay number 1. And the reason we pay attention to titles, you'll see there's another talk on this, but your titles have to tell your reader, prepare your reader for what you are going to say. And there is, for some reason, fairly pervasive belief among students just graduating from high school that you need to entertain your reader in the essay by creating suspense and not letting your reader know until the very end of the paper, as a big surprise, what your argument is going to be. And that model of writing, it's not wrong, it's a particular model of writing called the hypothesis model that they use frequently in the social sciences and in the natural sciences, and in fact in Europe they use it in the humanities. In North America we really don't use that model. We use what's called a tadpole model, which means by the time I've read your title and your first paragraph, I should know everything about your argument. Not about the topic, not about the general narrative of facts under discussion, but exactly what you are going to argue and where the proof is. And so after you've done that, the rest of the paper, after the first paragraph, simply becomes a matter of you going through the evidence, usually quotes from the text, to prove your point. So you want a very good title. It's the first thing that the reader sees, but actually it's the last thing that you actually produce, because you can't come up with a good title until you've fully articulated your argument and you know actually what it is you were trying to say. Trying to guess at a good title before you've actually written things out is not going to work. Let me put it one more way. You can't come up with a great title in your head, theoretically, unless you've actually written the whole paper out in full, complete prose sentences first. Point form won't do. You actually have to take the time and the energy to write the sentences out in full. Second, no thesis. This would be, this defect occurs in the first paragraph. So it says here that a topic is the ideas under discussion. A thesis is an opinion that needs proof. And you get your proof, as it says here, from various sources, the OED, the Dictionary of National Biography, critics, other sources, your class notes, and so on. So if you have no thesis and you just start by describing something, the paper is not going to do very well. Number 3 is related to that. A weak introduction, which is a poor thesis, or a vague and confused introduction, or an overgeneralized introduction, or what we call a naive or untenable thesis. These are all various forms of a weak beginning. So somewhere, I don't know how, but so many of my students ended up with this belief that the introduction has got to be a vague, general, sweeping claim. So in this example, ever since the dawn of time in all cultures, men have oppressed women. When you make a claim that big, first off, it's got nothing to do with the specifics of the text that you're writing on. Secondly, you invoke through your naivete a claim that may not be true, especially for your reader. And you have to assume that your reader is a hostile or skeptical PhD with expertise in the field. So you don't need to summarize the plot. You don't need to waste time telling your reader about what's going on in the text. You need to get down to business and say, here's what I think is going on. One of the best ways to formulate a thesis is to come up with a problem, for example, an incongruity or an incontinuity in the plot line somewhere, or a difficulty of interpretation that is ambiguous, that could mean this or could mean that. And once you have identified that problem or that difficulty, you can then articulate what the difficulty is and then say, here's what I think the best solution, the best interpretation would be. Now you've got a thesis. Now you've got an opinion that needs proof, and then you're going to have to show why you believe that is true. The danger about this vague opening statement is that it may not be true for others with a more extensive academic background. So a stupid claim like this in all cultures bypasses all kinds of matriarchal cultures and just shows a basic ignorance of history that that you don't need to get into at the beginning of your paper. So stop thinking about the opening as a big, grand, sweeping statement. The opening should be narrow, focused, right on the text. Here's a problem, here's a difficulty, here's what I want to argue this text is about. A naive thesis is something that is not just obvious, but bloody painfully obvious. So something like Shakespeare's Macbeth has a lot of reference to blood in it. Well, duh, yeah. That hardly needs proof. And it's not a self-evident fact, but it's a naive thesis because there are so many. You can just do a word count on that play and see how many times the word blood appears. Here is what I call an untenable thesis. Shakespeare intended Hamlet to be a likable character. And what makes this an untenable thesis is it has something to do with what's called authorial intent. And that is that the critic writes assuming that they know what was going on in Shakespeare's mind, in the author's mind, when they were writing the play. Yes, you can infer what might have gone on in Shakespeare's mind, but there is no way to prove it except by inference and indirect reasoning. It's very thin and very dangerous to make this kind of argument. There are certain cases, however, for example, in the case of Dracula, where we actually have Bram Stoker's manuscript and we can see in his own penmanship the notes that he made, the changes that he made, and the notes that he made to himself about why he wanted to change things. In that particular case, we can make some very powerful statements about authorial intent, but most of the time we can't. It's untenable. There's something called authorial fallacy, which is the mistaken belief that you, the critic, actually know what the author was intending to do. That's not tenable, so you want to avoid that as well. So try to stay away from these kinds of errors. The next kind of error is poor use of evidence or no evidence at all. Every claim that you make has to be supported by proof from the text. The only way to prove it is to quote it. That is a direct quote. And so here I'm saying quote often and quote short. And when you quote, I want you to use single words or short phrases. Don't give me a whole paragraph as proof of something. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but the most basic one is this. First off, your reader is a skeptical PhD with experience in the field. They have a copy of the text. You don't need to provide it to them. That's a shotgun approach where you simply spray the wall with the whole passage. What you need is a laser focus. I want this word, I want this phrase, or these words and these phrases, and you go in with some control and some discipline. The other problem that you have, and just try to follow the logic of this, let's say you want to quote to prove point A. And so your argument says, I want to prove point A, and now you've got to have a quotation. The longer your quote is, the more words there are in it. The more words there are in the quote, the more ideas there are in the quote. And what happens is, the longer the quote goes on, the more time I'm spending actually getting other ideas from the quote that are not related to what you wanted to prove in the first place. Secondly, the longer the quote, the more time I spend reading the author and not you. And now you've given up your own voice in your own paper. So you don't want to do that. You want short, concise words and phrases to prove every point. You can't assume anything. If you are unsure about whether your reader is skeptical or not, and this is a really interesting thing to think about. So let's say you want to claim point A about a text, and you have 3 pieces of evidence to prove your case. 3 pieces of evidence might take up so much space in the main body of your essay that you lose the focus of what you're trying to say. Or 3 quotes might be more than is necessary. So what you do in that case is you pick your strongest quote of the 3 and you put that into the text and you work with that, and then you put a little footnote number 1 to insert a footnote, and in the footnote you offer the reader the 2 other pieces of evidence that you have. So your footnote actually becomes a short paragraph, a kind of miniature essay where you continue with the 2 other pieces of proof, just in case your skeptical reader didn't believe you when you put your first piece of evidence in the body of the paper. So that will help you. And always what you want to do is combine quotations with paraphrase. You basically want to make a case that this is what the text says in quotations, and this is what I think the text says. Me, Peter, paraphrasing the text. Now I'm bringing my voice into the argument. And so quotation plus paraphrase are the best way to proceed. Also, when you put something in quotes, it must be exactly, literally what is in the actual text. And if, for example, let's say that your text has a spelling error, that it's spelled hello this way. And so you know that your reader is going to say, well, that isn't the way you spell hello. What you do is you put a square bracket here and you put the word sic, which is Latin for thus, meaning, yes, I know that is an incorrect spelling, but I'm telling you that's what's in the text. You could actually put this inside the quote, would still be okay. So you're assuring your reader that you know that is a typo, but that's what it says, and you can never mess with the original text. If you misquote something, you're basically being academically dishonest, so you don't want to do that. You want to take great care. And I say here what I've said before: assume your reader has a copy of the text, assume your reader is hostile to your thesis, and provide evidence accordingly. Also, what you have to do is provide evidence against yourself while you are writing. And this is one of the key points of academic writing, because in academic writing, what we're trying to do is provide a balanced view of multiple positions. If you fail to mention the arguments that undercut or undermine or challenge your position, your critical reader is going to think you did not realize what they were. And that is a limitation of insight that will hurt you in terms of your mark. You don't have to present all of the arguments against yourself, but you have to present the strongest argument, the most damaging argument against your case. To do anything less, to provide a weaker argument, is something called the straw man argument. Oh, sorry, I can't type here. So the straw man argument is basically you take the weakest of what your critical opponents might say about your argument and present that. And they call it straw man. It's like me trying to prove I'm a tough guy. I can stand in front of a scarecrow or a straw man and pretend to beat the crap out of it, but it's a shallow victory because the thing can't fight back. So you want to make sure that in terms of a balanced scholarly academic argument, somewhere in your paper you are presenting a counter argument. Now, there's all kinds of ways to do it. You can present the counter argument at the end. You can present it all the way through in terms of each point that you make, or you can present it at the beginning. It doesn't matter where it is in the paper as long as you put it in the paper. This is a very common error, that your quotes do not support your claim. What that means is that you want to say, I want to prove X. Excuse me, I go to read your quote. It's got nothing to do with X. Or if it does, you haven't made the connection clear. We call this a non sequitur. It's Latin for meaning that which does not follow. It doesn't make any sense. So you want to make sure that what you're quoting actually proves what you're trying to prove. Number 5, too much plot summary. I think you can't have a lot of plot summary in the final draft of your paper because your reader already knows the story. If your instructor tells you as an academic exercise that they want you to write for an audience, a naive audience who's never read the story before, then you would want to do a plot summary. But in most academic writing, it's not that kind of audience that you're writing for. You're writing for a well-educated, skeptical, critical thinking audience, a scholarly audience. So I think that as you get your thoughts together in drafting the paper, you do need to do a plot summary in order for you to get an inventory of all the events that have happened in the text. You can do that. I'm just saying that that doesn't appear in your final draft. The plot summary that you create becomes a catalyst for helping you focus on the ideas that you want to bring out in your paper. So be careful of that. Orphan paragraphs. This is an interesting problem to think about. You can't worry about paragraphs when you are writing in your early drafts. It just is going to distract you from the content. But here's what I want you to understand. In most academic writing, a paragraph by definition is 4 to 8 sentences of unified thought. Now, you have to be careful about this. If your paragraphs are shorter, 1 sentence, 2 sentences, 3 sentences, it is okay if you're in the discipline of journalism because they don't worry about paragraphs that way. But it is not okay in terms of academic writing. If your paragraphs go too long, forever, it means that you've got to break it up. So here's what I want to suggest to you. A short paragraph means that it's a kind of a brain fart. It either belongs in the paragraph above, or it belongs in the paragraph below, or it is its own paragraph, but you haven't unpacked it enough. You need more sentences in there. The other possibility is that that short paragraph has to be cut because it doesn't belong in the paper. Now, when I'm drafting papers, I never delete anything. If I have stuff I want to remove, I cut it, but I paste it into a separate file, and I keep everything that I've cut out. I save it in that extra separate file because sometimes in the early stages of writing, I think I don't need it, so I cut it. But actually, 2 or 3 days later, I realize, oh, geez, maybe I need that and I can bring it back. So you never want to delete, you just want to cut and save elsewhere. So that's how you manage your paragraphs. Number 7 is also a very problematic area for a lot of students. The introduction of irrelevant material or a poor focus. So a lot of times students, when they are writing a paper on a particular author, will spend the opening paragraph talking about that author's biography, where they were born, who they married, how they died, who their friends were. If that information isn't being used in support of your argument as evidence to prove something, it's irrelevant. Cut it out. You don't need it. Also, when you start with your paper in the early drafts, you're going to list the points in whatever order they occur to your mind as you think through it. I don't believe in filtering or editing or censoring myself in the early drafts. I say what I want to say, how I want to say it, in whatever order I want to say. But when you begin to reorganize your material, you have to start with the longest and strongest pieces of evidence first. Then you move to the second and the third and the fourth, so that the paper, I come back to this tadpole model, starts with the biggest, most important stuff first, and then the second most, and then the third most, and then the fourth most. And for those of you who are trying to meet a particular word length, what you do is by starting with the longest and strongest, you get the most important stuff said. Then if you still have, let's say you've got 500 words left in terms of what the assignment requirements are, then you can add the second most important point. And if you still have room left, then you can go down to the third most important point. But you can't decide what the most important point is until you've written out all the points. So I want to make a distinction here between product and process. And that means that in the writing process, you're going to need to generate everything first, probably without thinking about it too much. When you have to edit that down to get it into a product, you're going to have to start with your longest and strongest and then move down to the secondary. Plagiarism, you should know about by now. There's a contract that you've signed. You cannot use anyone else's words or ideas directly or indirectly. You can't even do it unconsciously. So you have to be really, really careful and responsible in your research. And when you are researching ideas, you can't just glance through and read through and absorb ideas without writing something down about where it comes from. Because if you don't document where it comes from, what happens to all of us humans is that it gets absorbed into our unconscious mind, and eventually, because we forget where we read it or who said it first, we take ownership of it and we say it's our idea when in fact it isn't. So be careful of that. Academic honesty is so painfully direct, I'm not going to bother talking about it. You should get it. Now, minor elements in descending order of importance. Overstatements, failing to meet the assignment requirements, incorrect documentation, run-on sentences, dangling participles, sentence fragments. Look these up on the web and take a look at what they mean and examples, and make sure you don't have them. You can use tools to correct your grammar. There is a particularly good one called Grammarly. You can Google it. There's a part of it that's free, but I have a subscription. I think it's fantastic. It allows you to upload an essay, and it just does fantastic things. Corrects all of your dangling participles, what we call a hyphenated adjective, where you have two adjectives describing the same noun. For example, two-time friend. To and time are both adjectives describing friend, so when you have two adjectives describing one noun, you actually have to hyphenate them. That is a hyphenated adjective. So it corrects all of those things. To me, it's worth a subscription. If that subscription is not affordable for you or going to cut into your beer money, Microsoft Word has a built-in grammar checker. It's not great, but it's better than nothing, and just go to YouTube and look up how to use it. You don't want to use colloquial or cliched or slang English without context. However, it is okay in all of my courses, and in fact in most of my colleagues' courses, to use the pronoun I. You have to do that in order to articulate your own voice and to make your own position clear. There is a text called They Say, I Say, that explains why it's okay to use your own voice, and you should take a look at that when you get a chance. Inconsistent verb tense use, where you talk in the present in one part of the sentence and the past in another. Just one codicil to this. You always talk about the actions of a text in the present tense. So you don't want to say Hamlet took action at the end of the play. Took is the past tense. You want to say Hamlet takes action at the end of the play. It's a constant living present. All right. The rest of these are small potatoes. I hope that gives you some focus and something to work on as you begin to revise your paper. One final point about all of this. You can't implement these at the beginning of the writing process. I want to emphasize again, I think you should write the paper the way you've always written papers until you get to the point where you think you're ready to hand it in. You think it's so good that you can hand it in. At that point, that's when you need to start doing these revisions. And it's not uncommon for a short paper, a 2,000-word paper, to require sometimes 5 to 10, maybe even more, 15 hours of revision and polishing and honing down your language and making sure you've got the right words to describe the right ideas, cutting the flab and the extra verbiage, and really sort of making your paper concise and focused. So good luck with your papers.